When an executive successfully navigates a multinational corporation through a fiscal quarter, the prevailing narrative attributes this success almost entirely to their inherent character and strategic genius. However, an empirical deconstruction of the corporate ecosystem reveals a different reality. Most of what is celebrated and rewarded as effective leadership is heavily structured behavior, a highly choreographed compliance forced by the environment. This forced behavior relies on organizational scaffolding. In corporate management, scaffolding comprises the visible and invisible frameworks that dictate and enforce professional conduct. It includes hierarchical titles that demand deference, legal departments that define strict ethical boundaries, and PR teams that script expressions of empathy. By calculating risk and strictly controlling public output, this massive structural matrix artificially masks true character. It overrides individual volatility. An ethically compromised manager will operate flawlessly within regulatory guidelines because continuous auditing provides an impenetrable perimeter of accountability. What is often labeled executive presence, the articulation of vision, the unwavering confidence under scrutiny, is a curated aesthetic. It mimics genuine ethical decision-making, but requires no actual moral reasoning from the individual delivering the performance. The danger lies in confusing the scaffolding for the building. The illusion of practiced leadership holds only as long as this structural support remains intact. Modern organizations do not reveal strong leaders. They heavily regulate volatile ones. When an external shock strips away the scaffolding, institutions are left deeply vulnerable to the unfiltered character that remains. To understand why effective executives fail spectacularly without oversight, we must look at the baseline problem. The human individual is inherently unpredictable, prone to darker impulses, and must be stabilized by organizations. Situational strength theory explains this containment. The theory posits that environments exert psychological pressure to enforce specific behaviors, inducing uniform response patterns across different people. A strong situation achieves this through specific facets. First is clarity, where granular metrics leave no room for interpretation. Second is consistency, where unified corporate directives create a tunnel vision. Third are constraints, the automated workflows that minimize individual autonomy. Finally, consequences. Failing a code results in swift termination, while adherence yields lucrative bonuses. The continuous interaction of these four forces creates a psychological iron cage. Within a truly strong situation, core personality traits, whether a chronic lack of empathy or high levels of narcissism, are effectively compressed and restricted. The situation completely dominates the person. When a volatile individual exhibits perfect restraint during a high-stakes board meeting, the behavior is not driven by internal moral reasoning. It is a mathematical calculation of risk and reward within an ecosystem where the reputational consequences of an outburst are immediate. In a strong situation, disciplined, ethical conduct is a testament to the inescapable strength of the environment, not the character of the individual. If situational strength provides latent psychological pressure, the active mechanism that enforces it is perpetual visibility. This dynamic mirrors panopticism, a sociological concept regarding disciplinary power. The panopticon describes a system where individuals are subjected to continuous observation, forcing them to internalize the surveillance and become their own wardens. The concept derives from Jeremy Bentham's 18th century architectural design for a prison, consisting of a central watchtower surrounded by backlit cells. Because the gaze of the guard is unverifiable, but theoretically omnipresent, the inmates automatically police their own behavior to conform to the rules. The modern corporate panopticon replaces stone and iron with ubiquitous 360-degree feedback mechanisms, continuous algorithmic management, and hypercritical scrutiny of digital records. Under this crushing gaze, leadership devolves into impression management. Executives engage in a conscious, goal-directed attempt to influence others' perceptions by rigorously regulating shared information to present an optimal image to the system. Sociologist Irving Goffman divided this performance into two domains. The front stage, the boardroom or the media interview, requires strict adherence to the expected script. The backstage is the private realm where the audience vanishes and the unvarnished self emerges. Maintaining the front stage illusion requires immense emotional labor. Leaders constantly engage in surface acting, faking boundless optimism or deep empathy, while actively suppressing exhaustion and frustration, rapidly draining their psychological resources. Panoptic visibility does not create internal virtue. It enforces docile, compliant behavior through the continuous threat of exposure, prioritizing operational efficiency over genuine moral courage. The ultimate unyielding enforcement mechanism of the corporate panopticon is the quantifiable performance metric. Organizations rely heavily on key performance indicators to quantify success. But this is governed by Goodhart's law, an economic target. It ceases to be a good measure. When executives know their livelihood is determined solely by hitting a specific numerical target, they optimize their behavior to satisfy that exact metric, regardless of the negative externalities, ethical breaches, or systemic damage their actions cause. This is a graph demonstrating a cognitive trap known as surrogation. The single line plotted here represents a nebulous foundational corporate objective, like fostering deep, long-term customer trust. Because trust is hard to measure, leadership implements a proxy metric, like number of new accounts opened. Surrogation is the process where this proxy replaces the foundational construct. In the Wells Fargo fraud scandal, toxic pressure to open accounts caused the proxy metric to soar, while the actual foundational goal of customer trust was completely destroyed. When an executive aggressively achieves all their KPIs through systemic manipulation or the psychological exhaustion of subordinates, the board of directors assumes they are demonstrating high-performance, visionary leadership. The metrics simulate success, hiding an architectural failure of corporate governance. Measuring a leader purely by their ability to hit targets in a strong situation tells us nothing about their actual ethics. It only proves their proficiency at exploiting the organization's incentive structure. Why do boards, shareholders, and employees continue to place blind faith in performative, metric-driven leaders, despite repeated catastrophic historical warnings? Our reliance on the fundamental attribution error, or FAE, distorts our judgment of leadership. This cognitive bias causes us to overemphasize individual personality and underemphasize environmental factors when interpreting the actions of others. When a company experiences a period of record-breaking growth, observers attribute that success directly to the CEO's innate brilliance. They ignore the macroeconomic tailwinds, the unacknowledged effort of subordinates, and the rigid organizational scaffolding that prevented the leader from making fatal errors. This error is compounded by the halo effect. Perception of one visible positive trait, like charismatic communication, causes observers to erroneously assume the presence of deep moral integrity and strategic brilliance. Individuals possessing dark triad personality traits, particularly narcissism, excel at front-stage impression management. By projecting the prototypical image of a bold visionary, they weaponize the halo effect to mask a deficit of empathy. This creates a fatal feedback loop. Believing the illusion of innate genius, the organization systematically dismantles the oversight mechanisms that kept the leader in check. They grant the executive greater autonomy and unchecked power. By removing the structural constraints due to cognitive bias, the organization triggers a weak situation where the leader's actual character determines the institution's survival. The breaking point arrives when a severe market disruption or an internal crisis creates a weak situation. The chaos obscures clarity, historical consistency vanishes, and the organizational scaffolding shatters, leaving the executive completely unsupported in a void. The case of Theranos and its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, serves as a modern archetype of this illusion. She adopted a signature aesthetic, consciously modulated her voice, and used masterful storytelling to generate a massive halo effect that shielded her from rigorous scientific scrutiny. Behind that meticulously curated hypnotic front-stage presence, she cultivated a toxic, unregulated backstage culture. Employees who questioned the technology were systematically bullied and silenced. A parallel collapse occurred at Enron. On paper, the company possessed a 64-page code of ethics, but leaders manipulated mark-to-market accounting rules to hit revenue metrics, actively punishing those who raised ethical concerns. They perfectly gamed the compliance scaffolding while lacking all internal character. Theranos and Enron demonstrate that an inspiring narrative and exceptional executive presence function as tools for systemic fraud when unmoored from internal truth. The distinction between a performative executive and an authentic leader rests on two motivational pathways. The first is compliance. This is transactional adherence, going along with a strategy simply to gain a reward or avoid punishment. It relies entirely on external observation and the active presence of the panopticon. The second is internalization. This is the profound psychological process where an individual incorporates ethical standards into their permanent identity. An internalized leader acts ethically independent of social influence, visibility, or situational strength. Modern corporate governance programs, relying heavily on continuous audits and complex incentive packages, are functionally designed to manufacture compliance rather than foster deep internalization. They force short-term adherence, but leave the organization resting on a foundation of sand. The ultimate test of leadership does not happen under the bright lights of the front stage. It happens in the dark. It is the ability to make the right, often painful decision when the metrics fail, the crisis peaks, and all external observation ceases. Organizations construct vast architectures of compliance to protect themselves from human volatility. But while organizational scaffolding can sustain performance, only true character survives its collapse.